For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Betend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. It's been 53 years since the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, and the damage that little bit of legislation has caused is truly hard to quantify. It's destroyed countless lives, pushed past the individual to decimate families and entire communities, and it's helped to create the out-of-control prison population that we have today. And yeah, it's accurate to say ruined lives, because mandatory minimum sentencing laws, in many cases, mean that people are serving life in prison for selling cannabis. And what is it all for? To keep racists in power, essentially. The Nixon campaign gave that game up back in the 60s. A few weeks ago, the Los Angeles chapter of the National Association for the Reform of Marijuana Legislation celebrated their 50th anniversary. Only 3 years after the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, NORML was fighting to repeal it. And they've been fighting for the past 50 years. Ian Rassman is the executive director of the Los Angeles chapter of NORML. I decided to call Ian up to find out what the last 50 years have meant for the original group fighting for cannabis legalization in America. Ian, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Jesse. It's my pleasure to be here today.
So we are just a little bit past the 50-year anniversary of NORML, the organization. I'd love to start, before we talk about the future and where you guys are going, let's just talk about how we got here. And can you tell me about the creation of the organization and what led you guys to exist in this world?
Yeah, sure. Well, this, as you mentioned, it is our 50th year anniversary. We're pretty proud about that because, who's been advocating for cannabis rights for that long? No one. So we were founded in 1970 by a fellow named Keith Straw, who had the foresight to know that we needed people out there advocating for reform to our cannabis laws. They weren't going to change on their own. So Keith started NORML, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML. And so we are organized in the way we're organized is we have a national brand, NORML.org, and then many states have their own chapters. Like, for example, we have California NORML, there's Texas NORML, New York NORML. And then for large states like California, we're broken down into a few additional chapters. For example, there's Los Angeles NORML, and we have Orange County NORML just down south of us a little bit. So that's a little bit about how we're organized. We are a nonprofit organization fighting for the big distinction here, Jesse. Mm-hmm. Unlike most of the other associations and groups within the cannabis industry, NORML is the only association that's focused completely on consumers, right? So it's not about the industry. We're very consumer focused. It's a we the people organization. That's what NORML is all about. We the people need this. We need reform to these laws. So very consumer focused.
And so going back to that sort of first impetus, we obviously, as we mentioned, are 50 years past the creation of the organization, but that also means that we're about 53 years past the original institution of the Controlled Substances Act. Can you talk a little bit about how that informed the need for NORML?
Yeah, so the Controlled Substances Act, that was really quite a thing. So the bill was introduced to Congress in September of 1970, and it passed on October 23rd, so just about 3 weeks and 50 years ago. Now, here's the interesting thing. This bill was passed with virtually no debate in Congress. Right? And it was responsible for the explosion in the U.S. prison population over the last half century. So as we all know, the U.S. now incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, including countries that we think of as authoritarian, sort of like Russia, China, Iran, and whatnot. So as we as a society recognize this 50th anniversary of many of the important victories in the civil rights movement, right? Because these two things went hand in hand. Civil rights was, in the 60s was really coming into its own. And so we should also note that the 50th anniversary of this incredibly destructive piece of legislation, what the motivations were for this bill and the impact that it's had in our communities, especially those minority communities that were so disproportionately affected by what would become known as the war on drugs.
That's a really interesting point, because you guys you sprang into action very quickly. 1973, within a few years, NORML was up and running. Did the sort of founders of the organization foresee what was coming in terms of mass incarceration and some of the negative effects from this legislation?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if 50 years ago, if they realized that was going to be the outcome of this Controlled Substances Act, the driving up of the incarcerations. But I will tell you something interesting. So I had a very, very interesting conversation with Keith Strupp a couple of years ago. As I mentioned, he founded NORML in 1970. So I asked him, I said, all right, Keith. So actually it was last year. I said, so all right, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of NORML, Keith. So can I ask you something? He says, yeah, Ian, go ahead. So I said, what if you knew 50 years ago that you would still be fighting for the reform of marijuana laws 50 years out? Would you still do it? Would you still jump into this knowing that it was going to take you 50 years and we still wouldn't be there? And he just had the briefest pause, and then he says, absolutely, Ian, I absolutely would. But I'll tell you something, Ian, and he's very passionate here. I'll tell you something, Ian. I was convinced that we would knock this out in 5 to 10 years, for sure. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. So now, Keith, that you see, and this was here in LA, now that you see what's happening to us out here in California, you can see that it's really become a big industry and it's very commonly accepted and whatnot. So now what do you think? And he says, well, tell you what, Ian, I still think we're 5 to 10 years away from legalization. So, this is the guy who's been at this for 50 years. I trust nobody more than him to sort of have his finger on the pulse of, the level of effort here. And this man's been fighting for this for 50 years now, always with the vision that he was going to knock it out in 5 to 10 years. So pretty funny. So if you ask me how much is in front of us, I'm going to have to go with Keith's answer. 5 to 10 years, we're going to knock this out, Jesse.
Just a couple more years. Oh, that's a great story. But you know what? It leads directly into a question that I wanted to ask you, which is exactly that. Can you talk a little bit about how does this 50-year anniversary feel? Because, of course, it means 50 years of still working towards your goal. Just, on a personal level, what does that mean for you?
I think that this 50-year anniversary comes at sort of a very important moment in American history. There's just absolutely no doubt that the year 2020 is going to go down in our history books as a different kind of a year than what we've been expecting. And one of the things that we've, and just even taking the coronavirus off the table there for a minute, what we've seen happen across the country with the Black Lives Matter movement is very significant. We haven't seen, I think, this level of participation across the country since the 70s. Since the late 60s and 70s, when we were protesting the Vietnam War and when racial relations were on the front and the center of the news all the time, and we've seen that again. And it's very important to recognize that the war on drugs has very, very disproportionately affected people of color. Okay, this is really important to understand. Our prisons have been filled up with people of color, and the war on drugs literally went in and targeted communities and inner city communities for our minority communities. And this had an incredibly disruptive effect on families, right? When you send somebody's father, mother, brother, sister to jail, you're destroying that family unit and the ability for that family to come back from things like that and, create economic opportunity for themselves, it's very difficult. So we land here on the 50th anniversary of NORML, again, at a time when social and community issues are at the forefront of what's going on television all the time. So it's quite interesting to 50 years. We're sort of back, I feel, like where we were 50 years ago, where people care, they're out demonstrating, they're out marching, and they're out saying that we don't want to continue like this.
So a couple of follow-ups on that point. What you're talking about in terms of the negative impacts on specific communities, specifically communities of color, that goes back more than 50 years, and it goes very specifically back to the Nixon campaign. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what we've learned later about Nixon's thoughts around the use of cannabis and controlled substances as a political tool?
Yeah, this is really. I'm glad you asked about that. This is really an important thing to understand, that the Nixon administration really had. Let's see. The Nixon administration. I have a quote here. Can I read you this quote? This is just a fabulous quote from President Nixon's advisor, John Ehrlichman. So he later admitted Nixon's true motivations for passing the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. Listen to this. This is the quote. Mm-hmm. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Do you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. That's the end of the quote. This is a straight up confession that the war on drugs was manufactured just to silence the people that we didn't want to hear from. So that's an incredibly scary piece of legislation. It passed with virtually no debate in Congress. And now it seems that we have lots of debate in Congress around undoing this Controlled Substances Act. And probably the biggest thing on the table right now to undo that is the MORE Act.
Yeah, and I do, jumping forward to 2020, things are moving very quickly. We expect to see a vote on the MORE Act, hopefully sometime in December, I believe. And I want to break down the places where that is an exciting thing and the places where perhaps the bill stops short of what activists may have hoped. But I suppose before we get into that, I guess I just wonder, as an organization, you mentioned the public's attitude towards cannabis and how we are seeing a more robust debate versus a time where this bill just sailed through Congress without any debate. Do you feel like you're winning the cultural argument?
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. 2/3, the latest polls are that easily 2/3 of Americans approve of decriminalizing cannabis. And we're picking up, historically, about 1 or 2 percentage points every year. So it just continues to grow. We saw what happened in the recent elections, that another 4 states added themselves to the right side of the ledger in decriminalizing cannabis. So we're at 30, what are we at, 38 states now, I think, with legalized cannabis programs. So clearly the great majority of states have enabled some sort of cannabis program in their state.
So when it comes to the MORE Act, your organization has actually taken a look at it, and I'd like to understand first, actually, just on a high level, nationally across the board, what exactly does the MORE Act do for cannabis?
That's a great question, Jesse. Okay, so The MORE Act, it's a very important piece of legislation that has been voted upon in the House, and it will be voted upon, as you mentioned again, coming up in December. And it has actually done well, and it's picking up more and more supporters within Congress. So MORE, it actually stands for Marijuana Opportunity, Reinvestment, and Expungement Act. So it very specifically decriminalizes marijuana. It removes marijuana from the list of scheduled substances under the Controlled Substances Act, and it eliminates penalties for an individual who manufactures, distributes, or possesses cannabis. So this bill also covers a few other things. It replaces statutory references to marijuana with cannabis. I want to make a very clear point about this. The very etymology of the word marijuana has very dark racist origins. Okay, it's a word that was used in the 30s to demonize. It's a Mexican word, marijuana, and it was used to demonize Mexicans coming across the border. So its very etymology and root is a dark racist origin of a word, marijuana. We make it a very, very big point here at Los Angeles NORML to never use that word whenever possible. Yes, I understand it's in our name, but we really try to make it a point to use the word cannabis. And I would encourage listeners to get away from the word marijuana and let's stick with the scientific name cannabis. Okay, so it's going to change that etymology. It also requires the Bureau of Labor Statistics to regularly publish demographic data on cannabis business owners and employees. It establishes a trust fund to support various programs and services for individuals and businesses that are in the communities that were impacted by this war on drugs. It imposes a 5% tax on cannabis products and requires revenues to be deposited into the trust fund. It makes small business administration loans and services available to entities that are cannabis related. And it prohibits the denial of federal public benefits to a person on the basis of certain cannabis related conduct or convictions. It also prohibits the denial of benefits and protections under immigration laws on the basis of cannabis related convictions. And it establishes a process to expunge convictions and conduct sentencing review hearings related to federal cannabis offenses. So this is what it would do nationwide. Okay, this is the MORE Act nationwide. Here in Los Angeles, as you may know, we are the largest county in the country. I don't know if you knew, Jesse, but Los Angeles County by itself is bigger than 41 states. Okay, so it's crazy, right? We're a very substantial community here in LA. As well, Jesse, I think nobody would argue that we are not the most cannabis-friendly city on the planet in terms of population, in terms of industry located here in Los Angeles, and in terms of dispensaries all over Los Angeles. Some are licensed and some are not. We're still struggling a little bit with licensing here in LA, but very clearly we're a very, very cannabis-friendly city. And as well, because of our large population, Los Angeles would stand to benefit disproportionately from the passage of the MORE Act. Let me explain why. I lost my train of thought, Jesse. So the MORE Act, as it may affect LA, due to our large population, the passage of this bill may release federal money and assistance disproportionately to LA County. There are 11 members of Congress in LA that could have influence in the passage of this legislation. So we wrote letters to these LA representatives asking them to sign on and support this legislation. And we gave them these bullet points that I'm about to give to you to say why they should do so. Why should they sign on to support the MORE Act? So, and even if you go to our website at lanorml.org, that's LANORML.org, you can find that pre-formatted letter so that you can send it to those 11 representatives and ask them to sign on to the MORE bill. So what's it going to do for LA, right? as I mentioned, more marijuana opportunity, reinvestment, and expungement. Let me just jump right into expungement. The MORE Act would expunge the records of those with prior cannabis convictions. And a study by the Government Accountability Office found that Los Angeles County had the most per capita cannabis arrests of any major county in the United States during the period of 1980 to 2010. So Los Angeles County residents, therefore, would disproportionately benefit from a policy that would expunge cannabis convictions, which often function as a significant barrier to obtaining employment and other critical benefits. So at a time of very pressing economic need, the MORE Act would provide a boost to some of LA County's most vulnerable residents. So this is important. As well, let's talk about immigration. Immigration is a very sensitive subject here in Southern California. So the MORE Act would also protect immigrants from being denied citizenship because they work in the cannabis industry. And it would remove the threat of deportation for those immigrants involved in minor cannabis violations. Immigrants make up more than 35% of the population of Los Angeles County, higher than any other major county in the United States. The MORE Act would thus provide critical protections to a substantial percentage of LA County residents and help ensure that they can participate in the growing cannabis economy without fear of reprisals by the federal government. So this is also very important. Reinvestment. So the MORE Act would also impose a federal 5% tax on sales, revenue from which would be reinvested in communities most impacted by cannabis criminalization. Because residents of Los Angeles County disproportionately suffered from cannabis arrests, the MORE Act would ensure that substantial federal resources and dollars are devoted to economic uplift in LA County. It would also reflect the principles that the City of Los Angeles's social equity program is in seeking to ensure that those communities most negatively impacted by cannabis criminalization stand an opportunity to benefit from its legalization. This is hugely important, right? Doesn't it make sense that we locked people up for minor cannabis convictions on selling cannabis? They sold cannabis and they went to jail. Oh, let's look around. From my window here, I can see a dozen dispensaries selling cannabis, and probably nearly half of them are licensed and regulated, and the other half are probably not. But people are out there making money at cannabis now. It makes no sense to leave people in jail for selling cannabis, right? In fact, they need to come out of jail and they need to be given a leg up to participate in the industry that they went to jail for.
Yeah, and so there's a lot there, but I want to pick up on one of the specific things, and I think it's one of the most important, which is that you mentioned that the MORE Act would introduce a process for review of federal convictions, so that people who are still potentially serving time in prison. I mean, there's a lot of people that are serving time in state prison and federal prison for cannabis-only convictions. What do we know about that process, and do you feel that is enough? There's specifics about aspects of this, but that is one that I haven't heard much about.
So to your question, is it enough? I guess the starting point is it will never be enough until everyone is out of prison that went to jail for selling weed. It's not going to be enough until all those people are out. If you're only in jail for selling weed, you need to be out today. So that's sort of my approach on it. Is anybody in jail for selling weed needs to be out right now.
Do we know what that process will look like yet? And are you at all concerned that process isn't fleshed out yet?
I think we're going to be fleshing out the details of that process as it goes through, because our criminal justice system is broken down into local, city, state, federal, right? So it seems difficult to have a single policy that addresses everybody. But let me take Los Angeles as an example for a moment. So last year, we Los Angeles went through a computer software solution to automatically expunge criminal records of people that were convicted of minor cannabis offenses. That computerized expungement yielded some 65 or something thousand convictions that were overturned automatically. That's fairly impressive here in LA to overturn 65,000. And then I think a few months later, they went and ran the software again and came up with another few thousand convictions that they were able to expunge. That's, I think automated computer expungement is definitely a good place to start just because of the massive numbers of people that are in jail. So that's one good method. But that won't pick up everybody that's in jail for minor cannabis offenses. So we need to keep going until we find all these people that are in jail and get them out. And that is going to look different at the, like I mentioned, LA County. We already did that, but there's not been a state level effort to automatically expunge criminal records like that, nor a federal effort. So I think, you could look at that example in Los Angeles and say, let's see more cities and counties and states doing something similar.
Sure. And when I'm not asking you to obviously explain the thought processes of people that you disagree with, but when you've had conversations with regulators, people adjacent to that world, where does the resistance come from for some sort of automatic retroactive release program, sort of like what you're describing, where anybody who has a conviction, as long as they're not also in there for another crime or whatever the criteria might be, automatically just released. Is it just like a political non-starter with the people that need to be convinced?
That's a good question. I have not encountered much opposition to people being opposed to automated expungement. I haven't seen that. I'm sure, of course, those people are out there, but in my experience, I don't think that's been so controversial to automatically expunge records. I think that's kind of been accepted.
But just to be clear, I'm talking not about expunging records for someone who's been released already, but someone who's currently serving time in jail for a crime. My understanding is that the expungement will happen automatically. We are going to create a device to have expungement for previous arrests. So if you have something on your record, that could be released. But all we have so far is sort of an allusion to a process for reviewing whether or not we'll release people that are in prison, which makes me wonder, what would that process look like on a federal level? And also, where does that leave state prisoners? And perhaps the answer to that question is that we just don't know yet. But yeah, I guess that's where I think you're right.
I think we don't know yet what that might look like at a federal, sort of from a federal level.
Interesting. And of course, when it comes to the direct impact to Los Angeles, you mentioned a lot of really great stuff. In terms of coronavirus and COVID-19 and where we're at, do you think that people are receptive to the conversation or framing this not just as a social justice issue, but as a potential economic opportunity?
Absolutely. So we're seeing that happen really across the country. I would say at many different levels. I would say at the local city level, at the county level. Let's just take Orange County, for example. As you may know, here in California, even though we voted to decriminalize cannabis many years ago, many cities and municipalities in California don't allow for any sort of retail cannabis sales whatsoever. In fact, I would say the vast majority of municipalities in California don't allow cannabis sales of any kind. in Orange County, for example, with his large population in Orange County, and Santa Ana was one of the first cities to come out in Orange County and offer retail licensing. Most other cities and municipalities in Orange County have not allowed for any sort of licensing. But at the moment, many of them are reviewing it. Why? Because we're clearly in economic turmoil here in this country, and everybody is sort of recognizing that cannabis and revenue from cannabis, tax revenue from cannabis, could be one of the things to offset some of the economic difficulty that we're all facing. We've seen that in nearly every state that has some sort of legal cannabis program, in March and April, when we were locking down for coronavirus, we saw that nearly all of those states and municipalities came out and declared that cannabis was an essential city service during the lockdown. So, when we were in March, when we were all locking down, you did have permission to go out and go to a dispensary. Dispensaries remained open. We played a part in that here in Los Angeles. We rallied our community. We sent a letter to the Honorable Mayor Garcetti requesting that if he were to shut down, go into a shelter-in-place sort of order, that he declare cannabis an essential city service. And that's exactly what he did. And we've seen that across the country. So we see that during this COVID-19 time, when everybody's economically depressed, cannabis is an essential city service. We know that there are some tax revenues that come from that. And many cities are now considering offering licensing in their city, county, because they need the tax revenue.
So to follow that up and sort of tie it back to what we were talking before, I guess I see how there's a political value now, on the economic side for politicians, both federally and on the state level, to be interested in the MORE Act. At the same time, a lot of the people that are in charge are people who have been around since the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, and in some ways had hands in creating the legislation that we've been talking about. So when it comes to our president-elect and vice president, who both have a history in law enforcement, creating and upholding and enforcing these laws, how do you hold them accountable to doing what they are talking about doing in making sure that we create restitution as much as we take advantage of the economic opportunity?
Good question. So I think clearly of all the Democratic candidates. So let me step back a minute.
Sure.
NORML put together a really wonderful tool called Smoke the Vote, and you can actually go check this out at vote.norml.org. It's an amazing tool. You plug in your zip code, and it'll tell you everybody that was on your ballot for the election a couple weeks ago, and it will tell you their cannabis positions. So as well, it will tell you even people that weren't running for office. It would tell you their cannabis position, give you an ABCDF report card score. So Kamala Harris got an A. She's from California, so that's not unusual that she would get an A, being from California, and with our vibrant cannabis industry here. I think Joe Biden, if I recall correctly, got maybe a B minus. I think of all the presidential candidates that were running for that Democratic ticket, he was probably the least cannabis friendly out of all of them. Every other candidate out there said, I'm going to decriminalize cannabis day one. Biden was the only one who really did not embrace that ideology. So now he's obviously president-elect. So we have as his vice president Kamala Harris, who's been a clear supporter of cannabis. So we're hoping that she's going to have some positive influence on Mr. Joe Biden in this upcoming administration. So I think that that's definitely something to watch right there.
Interesting. Excuse me. Sorry about that. I suppose, I guess kind of last question on that front. One sort of pushback that we sometimes hear from people that are open to the idea of legalization. I mean, I'm thinking very specifically about Joe Biden, and this is not a direct quote, but when during a debate, one of the moderators, I think, asked him, why don't you just say that you're for decriminalization of cannabis? And I think the pushback was something along the lines of like, hey, look, I know it's an injustice and I think that it could be beneficial, but we just don't know yet. Like, we don't have enough information. And there's a couple things there. I've talked to a number of people who have mentioned and pointed out that there's a lot of studies from around the world, a lot more. Other places have done more research into cannabis, and sometimes that research or science is kind of refuted because it's foreign. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But more importantly, going back to what you said, it sometimes feels like when we talk about mass incarceration in the United States, or we talk about racism as a source for that, we kind of talk about it as like this uncontrolled sort of like nebulous force that's causing these things, rather than, very specific institutional rules or laws. I guess what I'm wondering is, if we're kind of working with bad facts, is there a way to kind of like reframe the conversation and say, I just don't know how much Joe Biden is relying on information that may be very, very outdated at this point.
It's a pretty legitimate concern, Jesse. I think that, Biden's position on cannabis really hasn't been all that great. I think he's moved on from this gateway drug comment that he made. At one point he said that he felt it was a gateway drug. He's backed off of that position. So that's very positive. I think we're going to really have to look towards Kamala Harris to be the positive influence in this administration. Fortunately, she's from California, so I think she's got some California attitudes towards cannabis. So that's a very positive thing. So we'll see what they can do. But I think their power, our President-elect Biden's power, is really going to be severely limited if the Democrats don't have control of the Senate. He's not going to be able to just unilaterally deschedule cannabis, right? Because cannabis was put on the scheduled drug list by Congress, so it has to be taken off by Congress. It can't be done by executive order. Even if Biden was willing, he couldn't just make it go away. It has to go through Congress. So we've definitely seen the support in the House of Representatives for decriminalizing cannabis. That again and again, we're picking up more and more supporters, and that seems to be pretty consistent track record for the House, is to vote to decriminalize. And the Senate it has not had that support. It's been very controlled by the Republicans, and so far they've not had any appetite for changing the status quo on cannabis. So, unfortunately, Biden, even if Kamala Harris convinced him, would not be able to take any sort of executive action that would make a real substantial change on this. We have to see something like the MORE Act get pushed through Congress. That's where action's going to happen.
And do you expect the MORE Act to pass?
That's a good question. Gosh, I hope so, Jesse. I don't know the answer to that. I'm thinking back to what Keith told me a couple of years ago about 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years, we're going to have all this knocked out. I feel like I want to be optimistic with you, Jesse, and say, oh yeah, for sure, we're going to knock this out next year. But I don't want to be naive. it's really important that that the Senate takes this issue up. And so far, they've had no appetite to do that. So that's the difference that we need to see.
Fantastic. Ian Rassman is the executive director and president of the Los Angeles chapter of the National Association for the Reform of Marijuana Legislation. Ian, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
It's my pleasure, Jesse. It's been quite a thrill to come out here with TRICHOMES production today and hang out with you guys and talk a little cannabis policy. It's been my pleasure.
I couldn't agree more. You can find more cannabis industry reporting at trichomes.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at trichomes.com and following us on all social media. The show is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Betend, and thank you for listening.